No, thank you, Roberta. Yes, my name's Michael. I've worked with VoIP for 20 years, starting out as Asterix and doing some stuff with the various flavors of that, and then moved to 3CX in the recent probably 5 years or so since they, once they've updated it and made it work a bit better, they've put it on Linux and done a few other things. So yeah, I've been asked to present this webinar on securing 3CX, where I worked previously with an MSP. I was managing 60 3CX systems. I was doing that basically my full-time job for a good 3 to 4 years, and in that time, I think I don't believe there was any issues that came about. I was very fastidious in making sure that things were as they should be. So yeah, essentially what we need to discuss first is why do we need to protect 3CX? So what is the actual impact and situation that can arise if 3CX is attacked and compromised? Obviously, there's multiple different issues with having 3CX being attacked, ranging from financial complications to possible regulatory actions with various data breach legislation that's now enacted in many countries around the world. But as I like to, as I've noted there on the slide, I like to think the curse of a good IT management is that the customer doesn't know that we're there and doing it, and then almost to the point where they don't think they need us. It's if we're doing what we're meant to do, it shouldn't come up, and it's a bit like a good road. It will just, the car will run along the road without any issues underneath and not make us think of it. So a few examples of attacks on 3CX. You may have customers call and say, the phone's been ringing, and every time I pick it up, there's no one there. Another common complaint might be, my bill is very high this month. Where did I make all those calls? Sometimes you might get a customer who gets a call from one of their customers and they are like, we just had a call from you, but it wasn't you. They're probably the three most common attacks that a lot of nefarious actors will perform. Then you've got some more sophisticated attacks where they actually put a lot more effort into eavesdropping, in man-in-the-middle style attacks, where they actually implant themselves in the routing path for the RTP traffic and things like that. Or if they can get access to it, they'll actually install stuff on the server itself that's running 3CX, and then that will obviously give them access to all sorts of database stuff, the passwords if they're not encrypted correctly, and just general havoc that they can wreak on a system that's meant to be providing essentially 24/7 phone services. So regarding the first one and the second one, we'll look at this slide here. SIPVicious is a particular piece of software. There's multiple software platforms out there that will do this, but SIPVicious is a common one. I like to think of this sort of thing as a man walking, or woman, walking through a car park, just checking if doors are locked on cars. So they'll walk around and check for a car park, check on cars' doors. If they open, hey, they jump in and see what they can do. So SIPVicious will actually scan IP addresses. So yes, there are a lot of IPv4 IP addresses, but SIPVicious can scan thousands of them at a time, and it just checks, hey, is 5060 open on this IP address? When it finds one that's open, it then starts to probe that, and that's where the phantom calls come in. So it will actually check, is extension 100 a legitimate extension on this system? So that's where it'll actually invite. So SIPVicious will identify the IP address and then start inviting different extension numbers at that IP address to see if it responds with a call. Obviously, there's no call involved. It just sends the invite and then leaves it at that. But once it's then found an extension, they have files of passwords that have been compromised in the past, and this software will actually just run through all of the passwords it can to try and access the extension and hijack it to normally perform toll fraud. So, as my analogy goes, the guy's walking around the car park, finds a car, opens the car door, and then hotwires the car and takes it for his fun or whatever he wants to do. So this is one very common way that 3CX can be attacked, and if it's not protected, it can cost thousands of dollars, even in a short sort of 4 or 5 hour window, because of such high call costs to various locations around the globe. The third suggestion I had was caller ID spoofing. So it's actually quite easy to pretend you're someone else when you send an email. So you can just change the reply to or I am address, and you can send as someone else. There are obviously multiple steps and protections in place nowadays with email to try and limit the effectiveness of those spoofing, and not allowing emails to be sent if you're not the authorized person for that email. SIP does have a similar thing. It's things like P-asserted identity actually authorize that IP address and that system to send calls and other packets around with particular domains and such. So we can, in Breeze Connect, if you have multiple phone numbers on one account, we can say specifically on all outbound calls, we use this one particular phone number. There is a situation sometimes where that is actually not a number that we host, especially sometimes with mobile numbers. In that event, we just generally request some form of document to confirm that you actually, the customer actually owns that number and has the authority to use that number as an outbound caller ID. There were some upgrades done on Telstra systems recently where, for people who had a mobile number as their caller ID and the mobile number actually resided with Telstra, Telstra were implementing an IVR challenge for that call because they recognized that that mobile number, which they were hosting, was producing an inbound call to their network. So that was an interesting little period of time where we had to get a few systems whitelisted and allow those calls to be made without the challenge. But yeah, so there is a lot of technology coming out for caller ID spoofing, which should, like with email, lessen the opportunity for people to do this. But it is still something that does occur. And obviously, if an end user receives a phone call from someone that they trust, they're more likely to release information that otherwise they wouldn't normally. So it's important to make your customers aware that this is a possibility and it does happen, and to make their customers just think twice about revealing any information even if they've got a trusted call coming out. So some of the more intense ones, as I mentioned, was a man-in-the-middle attack. So this is where the attacker is actually able to change the routing path of the packets to go via a device or system that they have access to and they can use to essentially perform a packet trace. They record the packets, and with those packets recorded, they can then simply play the audio that is encoded through the phone call. They will also get the SIP signaling packets backwards and forwards so they can see who you're calling, when you're calling, and all that sort of information. It's not easy to do, as far as I'm aware. I'm not an expert, but it would take quite a bit of knowledge with various routing protocols and access to equipment and over the internet to actually make this work. But it is a possible avenue of attack for phone systems, among other things. It does it with email and that sort of thing as well. In regards to actually the server itself, obviously you've got different pieces of software running on different systems. In 3CX's case, you can have it running on Windows or you can have it running on Linux. They obviously both have their pros and cons in regards to how they deal with security. 3CX started out as only based on Windows, which is not the most secure software, shock horror. And they've since obviously moved over to include Linux in that to provide a different option for those wanting to be more security focused. Now, they're all the different attack ideas that you've got on 3CX. We'll now have a quick look at some of the ways you can minimize the risk and keep it as secure as possible. So firstly, the actual machine running 3CX itself. So obviously, network protection. All of these machines have to be accessible to the internet. That's how they work. So they will all need protection with firewalls, protection with the ports that are open, and whether or not certain ports are accessible to external networks and which external networks they're accessible to. The administration console especially should be locked down to IP addresses. 3CX has we'll mention later, 3CX has an inbuilt function to do this as well, but even just accessing the page itself, you can lock that down in firewalls as well. If you're running it on a virtual machine, they often have different options for firewalls. Otherwise, you've got your on-site servers who will obviously connect through the firewall of the site that it's hosted at. Passwords are always obviously a very big consideration, keeping passwords as long as possible, as strong as possible, and within reason, changing them and not keeping them the same as other systems, always having a unique password. If you're hosting on Windows, you obviously need to look at the security software that you're running with it. It needs to be up to date on its security patches and updates. Obviously, there's a certain level of consideration when you're looking at new ones, just to make sure that you don't somehow, with Windows, pick up another bug when you're trying to patch an old one. A lot of the new ones that we've got on Linux, they're running with 3CX on Debian. They as well obviously need to keep up to date with their patches and security software. And although it's much less common, Linux can get attacked as well. But as a general rule, it is more secure than a Windows install. So don't just put Linux out there in the wild and ignore it. It can still get attacked, and it still does have bugs and exploits that, if they're known, can be manipulated and affected to attack the machine that you're running. When you're in 3CX itself, as I said, you can actually restrict the management console of the system to a select IP address or selected IP addresses. That means that if you happen to have somehow someone's detected your 3CX from external to your system, you being the MSP, they may be able to see the admin console page login, but as soon as they try and log in, it will fail. It will not let them in, and it will not allow them to even try to perform any brute force attacks or anything like that. So in 3CX, when you get to the dashboard and you're looking inside the configuration, you can see here the page where you go to security and console restrictions, and you can change the option to allow access from specific IP addresses. It will alert you if your IP address is not in the list. That blue box where it says your current IP address is allowed will actually be red instead, and it will say your IP address is not allowed currently. So then you just need to click on the add button at the bottom, add the IP address that you're currently wanting to add, and click OK. So when I was managing the systems, the only IP address that could access the management console was the IP address of the office. This obviously meant that when I was on the road out remotely and having to do work on systems, I would need to VPN back in through the office connection to then access the systems. With the routers that we had and the software, that was a short half a minute thing to do to make sure that you could only access this page from the office site and make sure that other people couldn't get to where they were going. In terms of actual SIP protections, 3CX has inbuilt anti-hacking settings. This is directly related to the SIP vicious style attacks, where they sit there and they probe and they try and get access to things. I've always found the default configuration to be a little bit a little bit low. As depicted there, my general go-to was to reduce the failed authentication protection amounts to 5, the DOS attack down to 100, and I always increased the blacklist time interval to 10 years. I found that 24 hours was fine, but why bother having it back off? If you know that something is not right, then just block it and block it forever. If we're still using 3CX in 10 years, that'll be a completely different system probably, and they'll have their own new IPv6 based, hopefully, maybe, way of dealing with all this stuff. So that's one of the protections against SIP-vicious, doing all of the blacklisting of IP addresses and such. The other setting that is important in regards to SIP-vicious is to not enable direct SIP dialing. So this is where SIP-vicious can send the invite packet into the system directly, and the system acknowledges it. If you do not have this system enabled, the only way a call can get into the 3CX system is through the SIP trunks that you set up. So that then requires any invites, any calls that come in to come through Breeze Connect or any other SIP trunk provider that you have. So this is a very, it's not enabled by default, but it's one that should not be enabled. I don't think there's any reason you would ever need to enable it. There's not really any testing that you can do to do it. So that's probably something that you can just leave unenabled or disabled and not have those phantom calls occurring. Once you've set up the system itself, you then need to start setting up the users. 3CX does a good job of creating random passwords and IDs for each user. So it would be, it's much better idea to leave the IDs as the random jumble of characters and numbers. You don't want to change that to, say, 2000 front office or something that actually is a word, because that then is easier for SIP-vicious style attacks to guess and use to attempt to access it. If you don't need to use stun to provision phones, then leave it blocked. That is another avenue for SIP-vicious to register and use the extension. So if you just block it straight out, it can't do that either. When you create the user groups, obviously, as with many different IT systems, you give people the lowest membership that they need to do what they have to do. So you shouldn't have everyone as an administrator. You shouldn't be giving everyone manager rights. If they're users, they have user, and then you can add in the features that they need underneath that. The other thing with personnel and with users, obviously, if someone leaves, make it a point to have them removed from the system. The 3CX app, if it's on the mobile, will continue to connect unless the server no longer has that extension or user attached. The other thing to remember is try and avoid manually configuring phones. If a handset is not supported by 3CX, it's generally because it's older and it doesn't have enough security to match what 3CX have been implementing in their system after that phone was released. Speaking of phones, the phones themselves, as I said, avoid manually configuring the phones. If they're unsupported, it opens them to be packet sniffed with the eavesdropping attack and the authentication credentials. Configuring the phones with the auto provision process does have a challenge in it, so it is authenticated and it makes for a much secure connection between 3CX and the phones themselves. Wherever possible, if you can convince customers to do so, using an SBC solves many different problems that you may encounter, both with security and with firewalls. The new phones that are coming out from Yealink and Snom and Fanville, Some of them have an SBC function built into them, which means that you no longer have to worry about setting up a Raspberry Pi or a NUC or some other virtual server just to run the phones through an SBC. You can actually do it through a phone itself. It's always recommended and supported to use Ethernet to connect the phones. The Wi-Fi, yes, some phones do come with Wi-Fi, and it does work over Wi-Fi, but it's not supported officially by 3CX, and it just adds another layer of complexity to the system and another avenue for people to intercept packets and find loopholes and things in vulnerabilities in the system. Many phones also have the direct SIP dialing as an option. They normally don't have them enabled either, but some do. Obviously, protect the phones through the firewall, but in the case of stun, where phones have to communicate with the 3CX server over the normal standard TCP or UDP connections, make sure that this setting is turned off, because that is another way that systems can get in and just check if the phone actually exists. Having a phone isn't as critical, but it's just an annoyance for the customers if they're sitting there and they're suddenly receiving these phone calls and they pick up and no one's there. If stun is required, only port forward the ports absolutely required for the phone, which, if you need to, is the single SIP signaling port and 20 RTP ports. It is never a good idea to forward the access to the web configuration to a phone. It shouldn't be required. There are other more secure ways to access phone's configuration if that's important and needed. And yeah, the forwarding a web port to a phone is certainly not security best practice. One thing that can often be overlooked is actually the physical security of the phones. If someone picks up a phone and takes it away, is it going to work? Is it going to maintain its connection to the server? And is it going to be able to make phone calls that may not be appropriate? So obviously, we wouldn't necessarily chain a phone down to a desk, but if your customer has a phone missing, then it's wise to disable that extension or remove it completely from the system. When you're looking at apps, whether on the phone, a mobile phone, or the PC, or even the web-based apps, it's a bit harder to be able to manage those devices because, I mean, anyone can go and get a phone and set up 3CX in an app and scan their QR code. But as a general rule, it's easier to secure things on the server end with those. It's not as critical, so long as they use the 3CX app itself. So very strongly dissuade or don't use third-party VoIP apps like Zoiper or Linphone or any of those sort of applications. General security for mobile phones is expected, being biometric, fingerprint, iris locking. Try and enforce the option to have tracking, and if they're lost or stolen, they can possibly be wiped and set back to factory default and no one can unlock them and use what's on there. For PCs, the 3CX offers 3 different ways to connect. There's the old legacy app, which is still going strong with many people. There's the newer desktop app, which unfortunately 3CX had a vulnerability programmed into it recently. And then there's the PWA and/or web client, which sort of work through Google Chrome and interface through your system in using those. Again, try not to use third-party VoIP apps, the Brias, the SoftPaths, all those style. You can connect them. It does work, but it's not as secure, and it opens you up to not providing the best security for your system. If you can avoid installing software on machines that are not under your direct control, it's best to avoid that where possible. One part, if you're MSPs, obviously you can include your security suite on the PCs, as well as the 3CX, as well as the Office, as well as the different pieces of software that you are controlling. That way you can manage those PCs and be aware of what's happening on them to provide better security for the 3CX. Where people do have to connect remotely or from an unsecured device in that way, giving them options in terms of VPNs to connect from an untrusted network, or just using the web browser, which doesn't actually install anything on a PC on an untrusted device. That would probably be the most advisable situation, way to deal with that situation. Again, just like the phones, people can pick up a computer. It's a bit harder with a big one, but with notebooks and such, you can pick them up and take them away. Similar stuff. Can't think of the word. Sorry. Similar requirements should be in place with the biometric protection, password security, and again, the ability, if possible, to wipe the device or at least lock it so that people can't log in if a computer happens to be stolen. Again, that's all probably going to be part of the MSP product offering, and this is just another reason what to do so. Now, I mentioned SBCs before. SBCs are 3CX's inbuilt secure tunnel to encrypt traffic from the phones out to a remotely hosted server. The 3CX tunnel, it effectively forms a VPN, and it allows all communication and audio, so SIP signaling and the audio traffic, to be encrypted and sent through the network on a single port. It provides the function of simplifying communications between the server and the phones, because you don't have to worry about firewalls, NATing issues. You don't have to worry about SIP ALG issues. You can remotely administer the phones more reliably than having to just simply deal with the stun. And an important one for if your customer has 4G failover on a site, a lot of 4G failover will be CGNAT, and stun over CGNAT will almost always not work. Whereas an SBC, because it punches a single hole through all of those routing, it's using a single port that is a reliable way to connect the phones using a CGNAT environment, which is also incidentally what Starlink use. So if you have more remote clients who are looking at using Starlink, you will need an SBC to reliably communicate the phones back, because they won't work over stun. With the older phones, some will be supported through 3CX if you use an SBC, because that traffic is again encrypted. It is not the open stun style communication where SIP signaling is out in the open and can be viewed by a correctly configured packet sniffer. As mentioned before, a few of the new model phones that are coming out from Yealink, from Fanville, and from Snom can actually have the 3CX software and function built into them. They will replace the Raspberry Pi, because that is no longer supported as an option for a 3CX as of the new systems, the new updates that came out with 18. And the phones will also, they're a device that will be installed anyway to the customer, so it's easier to add in a feature to a phone that's already being installed than it is to add in a whole nother device that may otherwise incur more cost and more complexity into the network. There are other measures to secure 3CX. You can see on the right there, 3CX has international call blocking, where you can actually select and tell 3CX where it is allowed and is not allowed to call. So in the event that all of the preceding security measures may have failed, someone still gets access to your account. Maybe one of the directors went on a holiday to a third overseas country, and someone had access to their computer for a short time or something. If they have these call if they have the country codes as not allowed, so not selected, as is the case with that image, you will see that it doesn't allow the call out. 3CX will say, no, that call is not allowed, and there won't be any call charges. So this is another layer of protection over the top that will prevent normally toll fraud going through a lot of African countries and Central European and Asian countries where the cost of those calls can be measured in dollars per minute, if not more, and you have a few of those calls going at once, and they quickly rack up the cost. In terms of Breeze Connect, we have a similar thing. So if you happen to enable it, someone who didn't know what they were doing enabled their calling to Asia on the 3CX, maybe they wanted to call a particular country, but they couldn't specify exactly which country it was, and then forgot to turn it off. Breeze Connect also block by default international calls. It is something that you actually need to enable, or in our case, disable the blocking to allow those calls to be made. Again, standard practice is you allow as little as needed and no more. Don't give people wide-ranging access. There's another feature in Breeze Connect, which is the credit limit. This can be confusing to new partners and new customers. It is not directly related to payments per se, as in invoices and such. It is a protection that we've put in place to stop services from being provided when the credit incurred on a particular, or the charges incurred on a particular account reach a particular level. So if you set your credit limit to $50 and you're making calls and calling a few mobiles, and you have an invoice that's due, and then the second invoice comes due, or you've already made quite a few mobile calls, and the calculated cost of all of the charges that are on your account go up to above $50, we will stop the service from making any more calls. And in the case of 1300 and 1800 numbers, receiving calls, because that way we can make sure that if someone is compromised, they're not going to turn around and get an invoice for $5,000 because someone had access to their system for 2 or 3 days over the weekend when people were not there watching what was happening. We recommend that this setting be 2.5 times the normal monthly spend of the customer. Obviously, it'll take a few months to sort that out. That will allow for a second invoice to come due if their first invoice is not paid, and that won't stop their calls from being made at that point. Gives it a bit of a buffer to allow for the protection to be reasonable, but also keep their service running when they may have inadvertently have multiple invoices due at the same time. Breeze Connect accounts are also protected by two-factor authentication where you set it up. So you can't have any random person log in, create a trunk, and make phone calls on it, because if you set up your two-factor authentication, it will obviously need that challenge to be met before they log in. So that's a quick summary of the options. We're always available to assist setting those up if required when you're trying to make sure that your systems are as secure as possible. And I don't know if anyone has any questions. I haven't seen any, sorry. But yeah, that's as far as I can take this webinar. I think I've kept it to about half an hour. And if anyone has anything, just let me know.